Today we're talking about adding a focal point to the painting, taking a look at the painting compositionally and deciding if it needs anything in it to draw the viewer's eye interest into the painting, especially with the idea of adding or using another reference along with the main reference of the landscape.
Now in this lesson we're going to talk about adding interest to the landscape that we're painting. So what I have is a series of references that are good landscapes, and a lot of them would stand on their own, but you always want to be thinking, especially when practicing, how to improve on what you're looking at. And I have files of tons of landscape photographs, different parts of the country, but I also keep files and folders of just objects that I might be able to put into a landscape. When I'm looking at landscapes like this one, I'm trying to compose, or I know there's something there to compose, so I take a big wide angle shot and compose it later when I get home on the computer or sketchbook. But in all these photographs, I could add a little something to them. Both of these two are just south of Tucson. And there's interest there. I like the lighting. I like the shapes, makes a good composition. And these two don't necessarily have to have something. But you always want to be thinking about how to improve a composition, a landscape. So what we're going to look at here is how to add some interest to it. This is a scene in southern Utah. And I think it would stand on its own, but I want to talk about adding some things to these. So these are the basic landscapes. If I'm driving by where I see some interesting buildings, barns, houses, I'll photograph them, not compositionally necessarily, but just as ideas that I can put into a landscape. So that one reference is is 98% of the painting, and the other reference is just to add an interest. And I do that sometimes with trees also, but usually structures, something I can add into it. Because when I look at this, and the foreground is pretty much the highway. I do like the background, but there's a lot of clutter in here. This isn't an ideal background. But I do have the buildings here, the old house, and I don't know if that's a barn or what that is, but very interesting. And I could plug that into an image I have back in the studio. So all of these are images of buildings. And again, this could make a nice painting just by itself. The composition works real well. But I can also pick these buildings out and put them into another setting. Now what you have to be careful of is the lighting. I have to go with the lighting that is in the landscape, because that's everything in the composition is hit by, in this case, sunlight coming from the right, coming this way. So I have to adjust a building if I'm going to stick it in there so the light hits it right. I can't just put a building where the light's coming from the left and the landscape the light's coming from the right. So a lot of times I can flip it in Photoshop, or even just on desktop as I pull up an image, it gives me an option of flipping it vertically, and that way the light can be on the other side, and I'll do that. If the shape is simple enough, the building, I can just visually change the lighting. That's what I did on some of these here. So let's look at this one first. I like this, especially this area right in here, so I want to get rid of what I don't need. It's too much sky, too much on the left, too much on the foreground, and too much on the right. So I want to zoom in more. Be right in here and make it almost a square. I don't know if it's exactly a square, but pretty close. A little more clouds I could have. Again, my focal point here is below halfway, or not my focal point, my horizon line. If I were to scrape off the trees and the mountains and just had the sky and the flat plane, that's about where it'd meet. But I've got it below midpoint. This is about midpoint. So I could raise it up a little bit higher, have more foreground, less sky, but I don't want to put the horizon line right in the middle. Have it either above the horizon line or below it, but not right in the middle. I do happen to like the clouds a bit more than the foreground. Foreground's not all that interesting. But I want to place something in here, and I've got, of course I'm going to ignore the telephone pole, but I got this on the somewhat just to the right of center, and then these trees just to the left of center. So I'm going to take a barn. That's an old adobe barn in Tubac, Arizona. I'm going to go back because I did not crop that quite right. Let's change that. I want the building a bit more towards center without being in the center. And this is what I like about Photoshop, is I can rework it fairly easy. I still have to do the thumbnails with pencil and paper. I think that really sharpens your eye more than the computer does, but this is a good way to start kind of cropping, zooming in. Now I can place the building, and that just adds a lot more interest to it. Again, in this photograph, it's not really necessary, but it's an old adobe barn, well over 100 years old, and it's in a small little town in Tubac. But I want it tucked back in there, so I make sure I bring the grass up. And I have the lighting the same. I don't think I put that photograph on here. Here we go. Here's the photograph I put in there. And the light was coming from the right direction, so it made it easier to do. So when I have that in there, and we can zoom in a bit more, but it adds a bit more to the composition. And I might even crop it a little bit more like that. And without it, it just still works, but it adds a bit more interest, maybe a bit of a human element to it, that I think improves on the composition some. The next one here, this is also in southern Arizona, and I like this, the crowd, the old mesquite tree, the shapes of the background hill. This is a wash down below here. It's dry most of the year, but I like the wall, the bank of the river, and this strong dark and light contrast, but still adding a little bit something to it. And here's the barn added back there. And when I add something like that, I'm thinking in terms of contrast. The real light roof against the dark tree. I wouldn't put the barn over in here. I could, but then the tree and the barn are just almost side by side. The minute they overlap, it creates more interest. So overlapping your shapes, tucking them back in behind something, instead of seeing the whole barn, which I did here also. It's tucked back in the trees. You don't see the back end of the barn. It's overlapped by the trees. And that creates a lot more interest than just the barn, the whole barn sitting there like it's been pasted on the canvas. And here is that barn in southern Arizona, and just placing it right there. Now I've changed it up some. I had to change the lighting because the lighting was coming from the right a little bit and up a little bit higher, almost kind of backlit. And in the painting or in the photograph here, I had to make it come from the left side. So I just warmed up this area. The roof is still real light, and it's that contrast of the light roof here and the dark tree that creates a lot of interest. Plus, the somewhat dark fence and the real dark area inside the barn. So I'm looking for as much interest as possible and where I can overlap shapes. Adding a few more of the fence posts to create some interest in there. And this one also needs to be cropped. I usually will crop 3 or 4 times, kind of exhaust the possibilities. You think you know what looks best until you try it, and that works pretty good. Now it's way too centered. I centered it exactly, and I don't want to do that. So I'll go back and redo it. And I might do it a bit more vertically than square. And I want a bit more to the left because of the fence, and not as much to the right of the barn. So now it's more vertical, less square, and the barn is off-center a lot more. And I might even pull it back a bit more and show a bit more on the left. But it's off-center and works pretty good. Might even show a bit more of the bottom of the creek. But going through that process of how much to crop, what to leave in, what to take out, because the composition is what carries everything. Let's get a bigger view here. Crop a bit more off the left, show a bit more of the bottom. Closer to square, but more of a rectangle. That might work a little bit better. I like seeing the flat plane down here in the wash. Pushes everything back a little bit into the picture plane. Now the other one here, this is in southern Utah. This works pretty good. A nice contrast between the dark, warm rocks in the background and the real light, warm yellow-green trees, plus the violet in the shadows. So a strong violet-yellow combination of complementary colors makes the color and the composition very strong. Whenever you get complementary colors next to each other, it works real well. But adding a barn here creates more interest. Now I didn't pop the color. The colors are very natural looking. They're not man-made looking. It's old, worn-out wood with kind of a rusty, dark roof. But my lightest color would be in there, and my darkest darks are around in here also. And that makes that pop out. It just adds, again, a bit more interest. Without it, still works. It just adds a bit more interest. Now it's a little centered, So I have to decide, I want a bit more on the left side of the painting, and I'll cut off a lot of the right side. But I'm putting the building to the right of center, and that works pretty good. It's just off center a little bit and nice contrast in there. And the more of these you have to work with, the more you can go through different ideas of what would fit in. Before the computer, I had sketchbooks full of barns, houses, and would use sketchbooks, small drawings, and small color studies, and kind of combine them on paper first, then on a smaller canvas, and then if that works, I would do it bigger. But it's a good way to add interest when something's not there. It also gets you away from just copying the photograph. It gets you thinking about how can I improve the painting, and you're not relying on what's in the reference totally.